There is a man sitting in a pile of ashes. He is using a broken piece of pottery to scrape the sores covering his body. Not because it helps, because there is nothing else to do with his hands. Around him, 3 men have been sitting in silence for 7 days. 7 days. They traveled from different cities when they heard what happened to him. They looked at him, and they sat down, and they have not spoken a single word since. A week ago, this man had everything. Now he has ashes, broken pottery, and 3 friends who cannot speak. Here is the question that will follow us through every chapter of this story. What do you say to someone who did nothing wrong and lost everything anyway? What do you say when every explanation you reach for sounds hollow before it leaves your mouth? And underneath that question, a harder one, if this can happen to him, what does that mean for the rest of us? That is what the book of Job is actually about. Not patience, not endurance, not waiting long enough to get your stuff back. The book of Job is about what happens when the world stops making the kind of sense you built your life around, and what a person does when they find themselves sitting in the ruins of everything they thought they knew. The man in the ashes is named Job, and what happened to him is one of the most dangerous questions ever preserved inside any sacred text. Most people think they know the story of Job. Good man, loses everything, suffers, stays faithful, gets it all back. The end. That version is not wrong exactly. It just leaves out everything that makes the actual book worth reading. It leaves out the rage, the legal demands, the poetry that sounds like a man tearing the sky open with his bare hands. It leaves out the 3 friends who arrive to comfort him and end up putting him on trial instead. It leaves out the God who shows up in a whirlwind and answers none of the questions Job actually asked. It leaves out the ending that has quietly troubled serious readers for 3,000 years. The comfortable version of Job is a story about patience rewarded. The actual book of Job is something far more unsettling. Job belongs to a category of ancient writing called wisdom literature, sitting alongside Proverbs and Ecclesiastes in the Hebrew Scriptures. These books circle around a single human question: how do you live well in a world you did not design and cannot fully control? Proverbs approaches that question with confidence. Wisdom leads to flourishing. The world has a moral order, and if you pay attention and live rightly, that order tends to work in your favor. Job is not so sure. What makes Job different is not that it denies God or calls the universe meaningless. It takes a man who lived exactly the way Proverbs says to live, who held to the moral order with everything he had, and it watches while everything in his life falls apart without explanation. And then it watches what he does next. What he does next is not quiet acceptance. It is one of the most sustained arguments in all of ancient literature. Job, his friends, and eventually God himself enter a conversation about suffering and justice and the limits of human understanding that has never been fully resolved. Because it is not the kind of question that gets fully resolved. Many people come to religious texts looking for answers. Job refuses to give them cheaply. There is a version of faith that cannot survive this book, a faith built entirely on the idea that righteousness guarantees reward, that suffering is always punishment, that the universe is a clean transaction between human behavior and divine response. Job takes that faith and puts it through a fire. What comes out the other side is smaller and stranger and more honest than what went in. We are going to read the whole story. The parts that show up on inspirational posters and the parts that do not. The speeches that sound like comfort and the ones that sound like accusations and the one that sounds like a man trying to drag God into a courtroom. The answer that arrives in a whirlwind. The ending that gives back what was lost and somehow still leaves a bruise. The question the book of Job is really asking has nothing to do with ancient history. You have heard a version of it every time someone you love got sick for no reason. Every time a good person lost everything while worse people kept everything. Every time you prayed in a dark room and heard nothing back. Job asked that question out loud, louder than almost anyone in the history of religious literature. And the world he was living in was about to give him every possible reason to ask it. Picture the life Job had before any of this happened. Not the numbers first. The feeling of it. Every morning he woke up in a world that confirmed everything he believed. He had built something real. Something that worked. The kind of life where the pieces fit together so cleanly that the life itself felt like evidence. Like proof that the choices he had made and the way he had lived actually meant something in the larger order of things. Now the numbers. 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, a household of servants large enough to run an operation that fed and supported an entire region, 7 sons, 3 daughters. The text says he was the greatest man among all the people of the East. But here is what those numbers actually meant in the world Job inhabited. Wealth like that did not fall from the sky. It accumulated over years and decades of decisions, relationships, and reputation. It required the trust of hundreds of people. It required a man who showed up the same way every single day, who kept his word, who treated the people around him the way he would want to be treated. In the ancient world, that kind of prosperity carried a specific meaning. It meant the universe was responding to your choices. It meant the moral order was working exactly the way it was supposed to work. Job did not just believe that righteousness leads to flourishing as an abstract idea. He could walk outside his tent every morning and point to the flocks on the hillside and say, "Here is the evidence." He was the proof of his own theology. And then there is the detail that tells you more about Job than any of the livestock numbers. After his sons and daughters held their regular feasts, rotating through each other's houses on a set schedule, Job would rise early the next morning and offer a sacrifice for each of them. He would think through each child individually. He would say to himself, perhaps one of them sinned in their heart last night and did not realize it, and he would cover it. He did this every time, without fail. Think about what that practice reveals. This is not a man who is righteous when it is convenient. This is a man who is righteous in a systematic, almost anxious way. He is covering the gaps. He is accounting for the sins his children might have committed without knowing they committed them. He wants the books to be clean. He wants the relationship between his household and God to have no outstanding debts. He is not being legalistic. He is being careful. The way a person is careful with something they genuinely love and do not want to lose. Job lived in a world where everything had meaning, where every flock of sheep and every healthy child and every morning of abundance was confirmation that the invisible architecture of the universe was holding. He had lived inside that confirmation long enough that the confirmation had stopped feeling like a gift and started feeling like the way things simply were. That is important to understand, not because it makes what is about to happen to him fair. Nothing about what is about to happen to him is fair, but because it tells you exactly how far he has to fall. He is not just going to lose things. He is going to lose the world that gave things their meaning. And somewhere beyond what Job can see, beyond any frame his theology had prepared him for, a conversation is already happening about him. A conversation he was never invited to join. A conversation that is going to change everything before the sun goes down on an ordinary afternoon. He has no idea. He rises early. He offers his sacrifices. He tends to the invisible architecture of his life with the same care he gives to the visible parts. The day begins like every other day. Before Job loses a single thing, there is a scene in heaven. The sons of God come to present themselves before the Lord. In the world of the ancient Near East, the image of a divine assembly was a familiar one. A court, a king surrounded by members of his council, each with their own function, each serving a specific role in the administration of the world. Among those who arrive is a figure the Hebrew text calls Hasatan, This is where almost every popular retelling of Job goes wrong. And the mistake matters more than it might seem. Ha-Satan is not a name. It is a title. The definite article is right there in the original Hebrew, the Satan, the adversary, the accuser. In the legal culture of the ancient world, an adversary was a specific role in a court proceeding. The adversary brought charges, cross-examined witnesses, probed for weaknesses in testimony, and presented evidence against the defendant. It was a prosecutorial function, a role within a system, not a figure standing outside the system trying to destroy it. Later, Christian readers would come to associate this figure with Satan as a personal embodiment of evil, and that tradition carries real weight. But in the literary world of Job's opening chapters, the text places the emphasis somewhere else. It places it on the role, the accuser, the one whose job it is to ask the uncomfortable question. And the question he asks is this: does Job fear God for nothing? The Hebrew word for nothing is hinnom, without cause, without compensation, for free. The accuser is not asking whether Job is a good man. He is asking something more fundamental. He is asking whether Job's goodness is real in the deepest possible sense, or whether it is simply the rational response of a man whose goodness has always been rewarded. Have you not put a hedge around him? The accuser continues. You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. The argument is clean, and it is uncomfortable, because it is not obviously wrong. How much of what any of us call faith is actually gratitude for a good life? How much of your trust in a moral universe is sustained by the fact that, so far, the universe has treated you reasonably well? If you lost everything you have in a single afternoon, would your understanding of God survive? Would it survive intact? These are not questions the accuser invented. They are questions that live inside the human experience of faith, usually dormant, usually quiet, usually only surfacing when something happens to force them open. The accuser is forcing them open here, in a heavenly court, before Job has any idea any of this is happening. And God agrees to the test. This is the part that has troubled readers for as long as this book has existed, and the text gives you no easy way around it. God does not argue with the accuser's logic. He does not say, "You are wrong about Job." He says, "Very well. Everything he has is in your power. Only his life you must spare." Why? The text does not say. That silence is not an accident. The book of Job is full of silences where explanations should be, gaps where answers should go, empty spaces that force the reader to sit with the discomfort rather than resolving it too quickly. The divine decision to allow the test is one of those gaps. You can build a theological framework around it. The text itself does not build one for you. What the text gives you instead is Job, living his ordinary day, completely unaware that his name has just been spoken in a conversation that is going to take everything from him. The accuser leaves the assembly, and somewhere below, in the land of Uz, the greatest man in the East is going about his morning the same way he has gone about every morning for years. He does not know the hedge is coming down. He does not know that the world he has spent his entire life building is about to be used as evidence in an argument he was never invited to join. The day still looks ordinary. For a few more hours, it still looks ordinary. The day the world ended for Job did not begin with any warning. His sons and daughters were eating and drinking at the oldest brother's house. A regular gathering, the kind that had happened dozens of times before and would happen again next week at the next brother's house. Somewhere across the property, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing in the fields nearby. The camels were on their routes. The servants were working. The household was running the way it always ran. And then the first messenger arrived. The Sabaeans attacked. They took the oxen and the donkeys. They killed every servant with the sword. I alone escape to tell you. Job is still processing this when the second messenger arrives. Fire fell from heaven. It burned up the sheep and the servants tending them. Every single one. I alone escape to tell you. He is still absorbing the second when the third arrives. The Chaldeans raided. 3 separate groups. They took all the camels. They killed the servants. I alone escape to tell you. And while the third messenger is still speaking, the fourth arrives. Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking at their oldest brother's house. A great wind came in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed. All of them are dead. I alone escape to tell you. 4 messengers. 4 catastrophe. The text repeats that phrase 3 times while he was still speaking. Another came. While he was still speaking. Another came. While he was still speaking. This is one of the most precise pieces of writing in all of ancient literature. Not because it describes suffering, but because it describes the specific rhythm of how catastrophic loss actually arrives. It does not come as a single blow you can brace for. It comes in sequence, each piece of information landing before the previous one has been processed, so that you are always behind, always reaching for solid ground that keeps disappearing before your foot comes down. The oxen are gone, the sheep are gone, the camels are gone, every servant who worked for him, gone, and his children, all 10 of them, gone. In a single afternoon, Job tears his robe. He shaves his head. He falls to the ground. And then he says the words that have been quoted in funeral homes and hospital rooms for 3,000 years. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. This is genuine. This is not performance. This is a man who has organized his entire life around a theology that says God gives and God takes, and God is worthy of trust through both. And in this moment, in the raw shock of everything falling at once, that theology is still holding. But this is not where the story ends. This is where it begins. Because everything Job said in that moment on the ground was true. And in the weeks and months ahead, the weight of what he said is going to be tested at a depth he cannot yet imagine. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away is a true thing to say. It is also a thing that is much easier to say on the day of the disaster than on the 100th day of sitting in silence afterward. When the shock has worn off and the reality has settled in, and the question underneath the statement starts pressing upward with a force that no amount of theological correctness can hold down. The question underneath: why? Not why in the abstract. Why me? Why them? Why this? Why now? Why would a God who accepted my sacrifices every morning, who watched me cover every gap, who saw me do everything right for years and years, why would that God allow this to happen in a single afternoon? That question is coming. Job cannot stop it from coming. No one could. And there is a second test still ahead. The accuser is not finished. He returns to the heavenly court and makes another argument. Skin for skin. He says, a man will give everything he has to preserve his own life. Take away Job's health and he will curse God to his face. God allows it. Job is struck with painful sores from the bottom of his feet to the top of his head. He takes a piece of broken pottery and sits down among the ashes. This is the image we started with. This is the man with the shard in his hand, scraping his skin, surrounded by silence. Now you know what it cost to get here. Now you know that the man in the ashes did not arrive there through weakness or faithlessness or some hidden moral failure. He arrived there through an ordinary afternoon, through 4 messengers who came one after another while the previous one was still speaking. He arrived there by doing nothing wrong, and that is exactly what makes the question so impossible to put down. She had one line in the entire book of Job, one of the longest and most complex books in the Hebrew Scriptures. Job's wife speaks exactly one sentence, and for 2,000 years, That one sentence has been used to define her as the villain of the story. The faithless wife, the weak one, the cautionary example of what happens when suffering is not met with the proper religious response. Here is what she actually said. Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. Augustine called her a helper of the devil. John Calvin called her an instrument of Satan. Commentary after commentary across the centuries used her words as a contrast to Job's faithfulness, a foil to show how the righteous man held firm while the woman beside him crumbled. But before we decide what those words mean, we need to ask the question almost nobody thinks to ask. What had she just been through? She was standing in the same household when those 4 messengers arrived. She heard the same words Job heard. She felt the same ground disappear. The oxen gone, the sheep gone, the camels gone, the servants gone, and then the last messenger, the one who said your sons and daughters were eating and drinking at their oldest brother's house. And the house fell, and they are dead. Those were her children too, every single one of them. Every birthday she had celebrated, every meal she had cooked for them, every morning she had watched them walk out the door. Her sons and her daughters, all 10 of them, gone in a single afternoon. And then she watched her husband get sick. She watched the man she had built her entire adult life alongside deteriorate until he was unrecognizable. Until his 3 closest friends looked at him from a distance and could not tell who they were looking at. She watched him sit down in a pile of ash and begin scraping open wounds with a piece of pottery. Where was she during the 7 days of silence? The text does not tell us. She simply does not appear. 3 friends arrive and sit with Job for 7 days, and the text describes all of it in detail. His wife is not mentioned. She is not in the scene. She is carrying the same losses in the same silence, and the story does not pause to acknowledge that she is there. She is invisible in her own grief. And then she speaks. Curse God and die. Read those words one more time. But this time, do not read them as a theological failure. Read them as the words of a woman who has watched everything collapse, who has stood beside her husband through losses that would have broken almost anyone, who has absorbed the same catastrophe without anyone sitting beside her in the ashes, without 3 friends traveling from distant cities to be present with her. She is not arguing for atheism. She is not abandoning faith as a philosophical position. She is a person who has arrived at the end of the language that faith normally provides. There is a kind of grief that is too large for religious speech. Not because the person has stopped believing, but because the pain has exceeded the vocabulary that belief makes available. When you open your mouth to say the right thing, and the right thing does not come, sometimes what comes out instead is the rawest version of the feeling underneath. Her grief refuses to sound religious. That is not the same thing as losing faith. That is what faith looks like when it is being crushed under a weight it was never designed to carry alone. Job rebukes her. You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God and not receive evil? The text says he did not sin with his lips. This is true, and it is worth noticing that Job, the man who responded with such composure in this moment, he's going to spend the next 35 chapters saying things that sound considerably less composed than this. He is going to curse the day he was born. He is going to demand a formal hearing before God. He is going to say things that make you wonder whether the line between sinning with your lips and not sinning is as clean as this moment suggests. His wife got to the raw center of the thing faster. She got there in 1 sentence, without the elaborate theological framework that Job will eventually need to construct around his despair, and then she disappears from the story entirely. She is not there when God speaks from the whirlwind. She is not present for the restoration. At the end of the book, she appears only in the most technical sense. As the unnamed mother of the new children born to Job in the final chapter, she is never quoted again. She is never given a moment of recognition. We do not know her name. We have her 1 sentence, and for most of the history of reading this book, that 1 sentence was used as evidence against her. But consider what it would mean to sit with her instead of judging her. To recognize that she lost the same children in the same afternoon, that she carried the same weight into a silence the text never breaks open. That, she said, the most human thing anyone says in the early chapters of this story. And she said it without poetry and without theological framework, because she did not have the luxury of either. The book of Job has been read as Job's story for 3,000 years. She was there too, and the story was hers too. We just never learned her name. When Eliphaz the Temanite heard what happened to Job, he did not send a message. He got up and traveled. So did Bildad the Shuhite. So did Zophar the Naamatite. 3 men from 3 different cities, each making a deliberate journey to reach their friend. In a world without phones, without vehicles, without the ability to compress distance into a quick text that says, "thinking of you," this meant days of travel. It meant leaving their own households, their own responsibilities, their own ordinary lives, to go be present with someone in the middle of the worst thing he had ever experienced. They came because they loved him. That is the first thing to understand about Job's 3 friends. Because the story that follows is going to be hard on them, and they deserve to have this said first. They were not casual acquaintances who showed up out of obligation. They were men who loved Job enough to drop everything and travel when they heard what happened. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. That detail hits differently if you let it land. These men knew Job. They knew his face, his posture, the way he carried himself, and they looked at the figure in the distance and could not tell who they were looking at. The man they were seeing did not look like the man they knew. They raised their voices and wept. They tore their robes and threw dust in the air, and then they sat down on the ground beside him. For 7 days and 7 nights, no one said a word. 7 days of silence. This is the part of the story that almost never gets the attention it deserves, because everyone rushes to the speeches that come after. But before any of that happens, there are 7 days where 3 men simply sat in the ashes with their friend and did not speak. And in those 7 days, they did something that almost no one does well. They let the silence be what it was. There is a specific kind of suffering that language cannot enter without damaging something. When a person is in the middle of a devastation that has no explanation, the arrival of words too quickly can function as a wall between the person who is suffering and the person who is trying to help. Words say, "I have processed this enough to have something to say about it." Silence says, "I have not processed this either, and I am sitting here with you in the middle of it." The 3 friends chose silence. 7 days of it, without fidgeting toward an explanation, without reaching for a framework that would make the situation more manageable, without the very human need to say something that signals you understand what is happening, even when you do not understand what is happening. This was the most loving thing they did in the entire story. It was also, quietly, where the problem began, because nobody sits in 7 days of silence without thinking. The mind does not stop. It turns things over. It looks for patterns. It builds frameworks. It prepares, without realizing it is preparing, for the moment when the silence finally breaks. The 3 friends came to mourn with Job. They sat with him, and they wept with him, and they were present in all the ways that matter. But somewhere in those 7 days, while they sat in the ashes and watched their friend and felt the weight of what had happened, something shifted inside each of them. The mourning quietly became something else. It became the preparation of an argument. They loved Job. That love was real. But they also believed things about the world. Deeply and sincerely believed things. And those beliefs were now sitting in the same room as a situation that their beliefs had not prepared them for. And when belief encounters something it cannot account for, the instinct is almost always the same. Find the explanation. Build the framework. Locate the cause. They were about to open their mouths. And when they did, Job's suffering was going to become something it had not been before. It was going to become a problem to be solved. The silence breaks on the 8th day. Not with the friends speaking first. With Job. Job opens his mouth, and what comes out is nothing like the composure he showed when the messengers arrived. Something has shifted in him too during those 7 days. The shock has worn off. The ground underneath the grief has revealed what was always going to be underneath it. A question that cannot be answered easily and cannot be put away quietly. The silence was holy. The talking was where it all went wrong. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Not God. The day. Let the day perish on which I was born. Let that day be darkness. Let God above not seek it. Why did I not die at birth? Why did the knees receive me? Why were there breasts for me to nurse? For then I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept and been at rest. Read those words and forget for a moment that they appear in a sacred text. Just read them as words a human being said out loud in the middle of the worst experience of their life. This is a person who does not want to exist anymore. Not because they have stopped believing in God, not because they have decided the universe is empty, but because the pain has become large enough that the alternative to pain, which is never having existed at all, has started to look like relief. The ordinary human instinct toward life. The one that gets you out of bed in the morning. The one that makes you reach for food and water, and the next day. That instinct has been ground down to something that barely functions. This is the language of profound grief. This is what it sounds like when a human being has been pushed far enough that survival itself stops feeling like a gift and starts feeling like a burden. And the Bible does not edit it. That is the thing that should stop every reader cold. This text is 3,000 years old. It has been copied and preserved and translated and read in synagogues and churches and homes across every century since it was written. And in all that time, no one removed these words. No editor softened them. No scribe replaced them with something more spiritually acceptable. The words that Job said in the darkest moment of his life are sitting right there in the middle of one of the most sacred collections of writing in human history. And they have been there the whole time. That is not an accident. A tradition honest enough to preserve words like these is telling you something about the kind of God it believes in. It is telling you that faith large enough to contain a man cursing the day he was born is a different kind of faith than the kind that requires you to perform composure you do not feel. It is telling you that the God of this text is not fragile enough to require flattery from people who are suffering. Job is not giving up on God. He is telling God, in the most direct language available to him, exactly where he is. He is bringing his actual condition into the relationship rather than presenting a sanitized version of it. He is doing the thing that is hardest to do when you are in pain, which is to be completely honest about the pain rather than managing how it looks to the people watching. Now here is what most people miss about this moment. Job is the hero of this story. He is the man God held up at the very beginning as the most righteous human being on earth. He is the man who, at the end of the book, God will point to and say, "He spoke what was right." He is the standard by which the entire narrative measures faithfulness. And this is how he talks when things get bad enough. Not with quiet acceptance. Not with the kind of composed trust that looks good in a sermon illustration. With rage and despair and a wish that he had never been born. The 3 friends sitting in the ashes with him are about to decide that this kind of speech is the problem. That a righteous man should not talk this way. That Job's words are evidence of something that needs to be corrected. Some spiritual failure underneath the suffering that explains why he is here and what he needs to do to get out. They are wrong. We know they are wrong because God will say so explicitly at the end of the book. But we are not there yet. Right now, Job is in the ashes. His words are hanging in the air. And 3 men who love him are drawing breath to respond. Here is what you need to know about those 3 men before they speak. Each of them made the journey. Each of them sat in the silence for 7 days. Each of them wept when they saw what had become of their friend. They are not cruel people. They are not villains. They are people who are afraid. Because here is the thing about sitting beside someone whose life has collapsed without explanation. It raises a question that is impossible to sit with for very long. A question that 7 days of silence gave all three of them plenty of time to feel pressing upward through the ashes. If this can happen to Job, what does that mean for me? Job was righteous. Job was careful. Job covered every gap. Job did everything right and still ended up here. If the system did not protect Job, what makes any of us safe? That question is terrifying. And the most immediate way to make a terrifying question feel less terrifying is to find a reason it does not apply to you. A reason that the thing that happened to Job will not happen to you. A reason that you are different from Job in some meaningful way. Some way that the universe will recognize and account for. The most available reason is the one they are about to offer. Job must have done something wrong. The speeches are about to begin. And the real damage is about to start. Eliphaz speaks first. Picture him for a moment before he opens his mouth. He is the oldest of the three, most likely, and he has spent the last 7 days sitting in the ashes, watching his friend deteriorate. He has seen the sores. He has heard Job's words. He has watched the man he traveled days to reach curse the day he was born. And in those 7 days, something has been building inside him. Not cruelty, something that feels, from the inside, like love. He genuinely believes what he is about to say. He believes it will help. If one ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? He begins. Yet who can keep from speaking? This is the opening move of a very specific kind of conversation. The speaker signals that what they are about to say is difficult, that they almost did not say it, that saying it costs them something. The signal is designed to frame what follows as an act of courage rather than judgment. It positions the speaker as someone who loves you enough to tell you the hard truth. Most people have been on the receiving end of a conversation that started this way. Then Eliphaz says what he actually came to say. He reminds Job of who Job used to be. Your words have upheld him who was stumbling. You have strengthened the weak. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. This is a particular kind of cruelty, dressed as high expectations. It says you, of all people, should know better. You have counseled others through suffering. You have been the steady one. And now that it is your turn, you are falling apart. Then comes the theology underneath all of it. Eliphaz describes a vision he received in the night. A spirit passing before his face. A whisper in the darkness. Can mortal man be in the right before God? Can a man be pure before his Maker? The innocent do not perish. The upright are not cut off. If you were truly innocent, this would not be happening. This is not cruelty as Eliphaz understands it. This is wisdom. This is the accumulated understanding of a man who has watched the world for decades and drawn what seemed to him like reasonable conclusions. He is not making this up. He is reporting what he believes to be true about the way the universe operates. Bildad follows. Where Eliphaz built his case on personal vision and experience, Bildad reaches back further. He appeals to the tradition, to the fathers, to the wisdom that has been passed down through generations. His argument is cleaner and colder. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert the right? If your children sinned against him, he has delivered them into the hand of their transgression. Read that sentence and let it land the way it would land if you were Job. Your children sinned. That is why they are dead. Bildad is saying this to a father sitting in ashes who has just buried every one of his children. He is saying it not with malice but with the confidence of a man who believes he is delivering a hard truth that will ultimately be more helpful than comfortable lies. In his mind, he is doing Job a favor. He is giving Job a path out. Acknowledge the sin, Return to God. Watch the restoration come. But here is what Bildad is actually doing underneath the theology. He is protecting himself. If suffering always has a moral cause, then suffering is always theoretically preventable. If Job's children died because they sinned, then Bildad's children are safe as long as they do not sin. If Job is in the ashes because of something he did, then Bildad will not end up in the ashes as long as he does not do that thing. The theology of retribution is not just a description of how the world works. It is a fortress. It keeps the terrifying possibility of random suffering at a safe distance. Job threatens that fortress just by existing. A righteous man in ashes is an argument. Not an argument he is making on purpose. Just an argument his existence makes by being what it is. And the three friends cannot afford to let that argument stand. Zophar speaks last in round 1. And where Eliphaz was measured and Bildad was traditional, Zophar is simply aggressive. He has no patience for Job's protestations of innocence. He finds them offensive. Should a multitude of words go unanswered? Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. Less than your guilt deserves. Zophar is not just saying Job sinned. He is saying God has actually been merciful in the amount of suffering delivered. Job deserves worse than what he got. He should consider himself lucky. Job listens to all three of them, and then he responds with something none of them expected. No doubt you are the people, and wisdom will die with you. But I have understanding as well as you. I am not inferior to you. Who does not know such things as these? No rage in those words. No collapse. Just calm. Precisi. Devastating clarity. Job is looking at three men who have spent their speeches explaining his situation to him. And he is saying, with complete composure, that what they have told him is nothing he did not already know. He has lived inside this theology his entire life. He has probably deployed these same arguments himself, to other people, in other circumstances, before he knew what it felt like to be on the receiving end. The difference between Job and his three friends is not that they have access to wisdom he lacks. The difference is that Job is the one sitting in the ashes, and from inside the ashes, the neat system of cause and effect that looks so clean from the outside looks completely different. He was blameless. He was careful. He covered every gap. He did everything the system asked of him. And he is still here. The map his friends are holding does not match the terrain he is standing on. He is not going to pretend otherwise. Round 1 is over. Round 2 is coming. And in round 2, the friends are not going to suggest anymore. They are going to accuse. Something changes between round 1 and round 2. In round 1, the three friends were careful. Eliphaz led with a vision and personal experience. Bildad leaned on tradition and the wisdom of the fathers. Even Zophar, the most aggressive of the three, stayed within the bounds of general theological argument. They were suggesting, implying, offering frameworks that pointed in a direction without spelling it out completely. Job pushed back hard. He did not crumble. He did not confess. He met every argument with a counter-argument, every implication with a direct denial, every suggestion of hidden guilt with a clear statement that the suggestions did not match his experience of his own life. And that refusal changed something in the three friends. Because when your theology tells you that suffering always has a moral cause, and the person you are trying to help keeps insisting that no moral cause exists, there are only two options. Either your theology is wrong, or the person is lying, and none of these three men are ready to conclude that their theology is wrong. So in round 2, the gloves come off. Eliphaz opens round 2, and his tone has shifted completely. He is no longer the careful elder offering difficult wisdom. He is now a man who has listened to Job's responses and found them not just incorrect but dangerous. Is it for your fear of God that he reproves you? Is it for this that he enters into judgment with you? Translation: the fact that you are suffering this much is itself evidence against you. The punishment is proportional to the crime, and your crime must be significant. And then, without a single piece of evidence, without any basis in the text beyond the backward logic of his theology, Eliphaz begins listing Job's sins. You have given no water to the weary to drink. You have withheld bread from the hungry. You have sent widows away empty. The arms of the fatherless have been crushed. Specific charges, not vague suggestions that Job might have some unexamined sin lurking in his past. Concrete. Detailed accusations. You starved the hungry. You turned away widows. You hurt children who had no one else. There is not a single piece of evidence for any of this. The text told us in its very first verses that Job was blameless and upright, that he turned away from evil, that he gave sacrifices to cover even the unintentional sins of his children. The man being accused of crushing orphans is the same man who spent every morning of his life making sure his household was right before God. Eliphaz invented these charges. He did not invent them maliciously. He invented them the way all of us invent explanations when we need one badly enough. The reasoning went like this: God is just. The just suffer only when they deserve it. Job is suffering greatly. Therefore Job must have done great wrong. And since his suffering is extensive enough to include losing all 10 children, the sins must be serious. What serious sins might a wealthy and powerful man commit? Exploiting the poor, ignoring widows, turning away orphans. The conclusion came first. The evidence was constructed to fit it. This is the logic of victim blaming, and it has not changed in 3,000 years. When someone experiences a catastrophe with no obvious explanation, there is a powerful human impulse to find a reason that locates the cause inside the victim. Not because the people making the accusation are necessarily cruel, but because the alternative is too frightening to sit with. The alternative is that catastrophe can happen to anyone, including the person making the accusation, including people whose careful, righteous lives were supposed to protect them. You can hear this logic today without looking very hard. The person who gets a devastating diagnosis and is asked what they were eating, what they were thinking, how much stress they were under, as if the illness must have been preventable if they had just made different choices. The person who loses their marriage and is told by well-meaning friends that they must have been neglecting something important. The person whose child struggles and is quietly evaluated for what the parents must have done wrong. The instinct is the same instinct Eliphaz is following. The world has a moral order. If something went wrong, something must explain it. And if the explanation is located inside the victim, then everyone else remains safe. Bildad in round 2 offers less theology and more contempt. He compares human beings to maggots, driving home the point that no one is righteous enough to stand before God and demand answers. Job's insistence on his own innocence is itself evidence of arrogance, and arrogance is its own kind of sin. Zophar, in round 2, paints a portrait of the wicked man in elaborate detail. The brief prosperity of the unjust, the way their children will beg, the way they will vomit up their wealth before they can digest it. He is describing a hypothetical, but his eyes are fixed on Job the entire time he speaks. Job listens to all of it. And in round 2, his response does something his round 1 responses did not do. In round 1, he defended himself. He said their arguments were wrong and his innocence was real. In round 2, he begins to question the framework itself. He looks around at the actual world and he points to the evidence. The wicked prosper. The tents of violent men are at peace. The very people who challenge God live out their days in comfort. If the theology of retribution worked the way the friends claimed it worked, the world would look different than what Job can see from where he is sitting. This is a much more threatening move than claiming his own innocence. Claiming innocence meant the argument was about Job specifically. Questioning the framework means the argument is about the entire theological system that all 3 friends have organized their lives around. He is not just saying, I did not deserve this. He is saying the thing you believe about how the world works may not be true. And if that is true, then the fortress Bildad and Eliphaz and Zophar have been building their sense of safety inside is not as solid as they thought. Round 2 ends. The friends are not finished, but something has started to crack in the confidence they arrived with. And Job is not finished either. He is only now beginning to say what he actually wants. Something is different by the time round 3 begins. You can feel it in the length of the speeches. Not the content, the length. Eliphaz in round 1 spoke at length, with the measured pace of a man who believed he had important things to say and sufficient time to say them. Bildad covered his arguments thoroughly. Even Zophar delivered a full and structured case. Round 1 had the energy of men who were confident that once they explained things properly, the situation would resolve itself. Round 2 was longer and harsher. The friends were escalating, pressing harder, because Job kept refusing to break, and the refusal itself seemed to demand a stronger response. Round 3 is something else entirely. Eliphaz opens, and his speech has a quality of desperation underneath it that was not there before. He has made the gentle appeal. He has made the traditional argument. He has made the direct accusation. Job has answered every single one of them. Not with confession, but with counter-argument, with his own observations about the world, with a calm and specific denial of every charge. Nothing has worked, and so Eliphaz goes back to what he knows, repeating the core of his position one more time, as if saying it again more firmly will finally produce the result he needs. It does not produce it. Then Bildad speaks, seeks verses. After 2 full rounds of careful theological argument, after the journey from his city, after 7 days of silence and 2 rounds of speeches, Bildad arrives at round 3 with 6 verses. He describes the sovereignty of God and the smallness of man. The moon is not pure in God's sight. The stars are not clean. How much less is man? Who is a maggot? The son of man? Who is a worm? That is the whole speech. The man who arrived with the full weight of tradition behind him, who appealed to the wisdom of the fathers and the established patterns of divine justice, now has 6 verses. He got smaller as the argument went on. Whatever he believed when he arrived is still what he believes. But the confidence that belief can be successfully applied to Job's situation has eroded into something barely recognizable. And Zophar does not speak at all. His name sits in the structure of the text where his 3rd speech should be. And then there is nothing. No argument. No charges. No final attempt to bring Job to confession. Whether he chose silence or arrived at a place where silence was the only honest option, the result is the same. The most aggressive of the 3 friends, the one who told Job he deserved worse than what he got, reaches round 3 and has nothing left to say. The system has run dry. 3 intelligent, experienced, devout men came to their friend with a fully developed theology of how the world works. They believed it completely. They defended it across 2 full rounds of argument. They watched it fail to accomplish anything, and they kept defending it. And then, in round 3, the defense collapsed under its own weight. They had said everything they knew how to say. Job was still in the ashes. Nothing had changed. Job, by contrast, arrives at round 3 at the height of his power, where the friends are shrinking. He is expanding. His speeches in round 3 are among the longest and most complex in the entire book. He surveys the created world. He asks where wisdom actually comes from. Not from tradition, he implies, because the tradition has just exhausted itself in front of him. Not from the kind of experience his friends are drawing on, because experience has limits that his situation has found. Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. This is almost exactly the description of Job himself from the very first verse of the book. He feared God and turned away from evil. He is the definition of wisdom by the book's own terms. And here he is, sitting in ashes, surrounded by the silence of three men who have run out of things to say. And then Job delivers the longest speech in the entire text. He reviews his life in detail, what he was before the disaster, how young men stepped aside and old men rose when he approached, the way he helped the poor and the widow and the orphan, the respect he received at the city gate, the way he sat as chief among his people, like a king among his troops, and then what he is now, mocked by people whose fathers he would not have put with the dogs of his flock. And then, in what functions as the closing argument of the entire human portion of the book, Job takes an oath, a formal, legal, exhaustive declaration of innocence. If I have walked with falsehood, if my heart has been enticed toward a woman, if I have rejected the cause of my servant when they had a complaint against me, if I have withheld anything from the poor, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless, if I have made gold my trust, if I have rejoiced at the ruin of him who hated me. Clause after clause, category after category. He is presenting himself to an invisible court with the thoroughness of a man who has nothing to hide and everything to lose, who knows his case is solid and is demanding that someone with actual authority hear it. The courtroom is empty. No judge has appeared. No verdict has been delivered. The three friends are sitting in silence, having run out of arguments. Job has completed his case and received no response. The air goes still. And then a new voice enters the conversation. A voice that belongs to a man who has been sitting at the edge of this scene the entire time, who has heard every word of every speech in every round, who has been holding back out of respect for his elders, and who can no longer hold back. His name is Elihu. He is young, he is angry, and he is about to offer the most sophisticated argument anyone makes in the entire human portion of this story. It is also going to be the most instructive failure. There is a young man at the edge of the conversation who has been there the whole time. His name is Elihu, son of Barachel the Buzite, of the family of Ram. The text gives his full genealogy, which is unusual for a character who appears nowhere else in the Bible. It is as if the author wants to make clear that Elihu is a real and specific person, not a symbol, not a literary device. A young man with a family history and a hometown, and a name that means something. He is a Buzite, which likely places him in the same general region as Job. He has been close enough to witness everything. He waited. He waited through all of round 1, through all of round 2, through the collapse of round 3. He waited because he was young and the other men were old. And in the world, Job inhabited. You earned the right to speak by demonstrating the patience to listen first. So he sat at the edge of the circle and he heard everything. Every charge Eliphaz leveled, every appeal to tradition from Bildad, every aggressive thrust from Zophar, every counter-argument from Job, every round of the debate, from the gentleness of the opening to the silence at the end. And he burned. The text says he burned with anger. Not irritation, not frustration, anger hot enough to require a specific word for it. He burned with anger at Job because Job had spent so much time justifying himself that the conversation had drifted away from God entirely. And he burned with anger at the three friends because they had condemned Job without finding a real answer. Both sides had failed, in his view, and the failure had been sitting in front of him for days, and he had not been able to say a word. Now the elders have gone silent. Now Elihu can speak. He begins with an extended apology for speaking at all. He is young. They are old. He deferred for that reason. But age alone, he says, is not the source of wisdom. It is the spirit in a man, the breath of the Almighty, that makes him understand. Great men are not always wise. Elders do not always know what is right. Then he makes his argument. Here is where Elihu separates himself from the three friends in a way that matters. The three friends argued backward. They started with Job's suffering and worked backward to his sin. Eliphaz said, "The innocent do not perish. Therefore you are not innocent." Bildad said, "Your children died. Therefore they sinned." Zophar said, "You deserve worse than what you got." Their entire approach was prosecutorial. They took the evidence of suffering and used it to construct a case against Job. Elihu does something different. He argues forward. Suffering, he says, is not primarily punishment for what has already happened. Suffering can be instruction for what is still ahead. God speaks in dreams and visions of the night. And if that does not reach a person, God uses physical suffering as a messenger, not to condemn, to correct, to get a person's attention in the only way that sometimes works, to pull someone back from pride before pride destroys them, to shape a character that comfort never could have shaped. This is a meaningfully different theology than anything the three friends offered. It is forward-looking rather than backward-looking. It is formational rather than punitive. The suffering is not proof of a crime already committed. It is the possibility of a life being built into something better than it was. And this idea has never fully disappeared. You can find it in almost every major tradition that has tried to make sense of human suffering. The fire that refines, the pressure that produces strength, the difficulty that reveals what a person is actually made of. These are not primitive or easily dismissed ideas. They are ideas that have survived because they match something real about human experience. Elihu delivers all of this with genuine passion. He is not performing wisdom. He is a young man who has thought hard about these questions and arrived at what he sincerely believes is the answer the older men missed. He goes further. He begins to describe God in language that anticipates almost exactly what God himself is about to say from the whirlwind. The thunder, the lightning, the clouds, the way God commands the snow to fall on the earth and the rain to pour on the land. He is reaching, with every tool available to him, toward something he can feel gathering at the edge of the world. He can feel the storm coming. Now here is the strangest detail in the entire Elihu section. At the end of the book, after the whirlwind, after Job has responded and God has delivered his verdict, God turns to Eliphaz and says, "My anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." He names Eliphaz. He names the two friends. He requires them to bring offerings and have Job pray for them. He does not mention Elihu, not to condemn him, not to commend him, not a single word about the young man who spoke the longest and most passionate argument in the entire human section of the debate. Elihu walks into the story in chapter 32 and vanishes before chapter 38. He is there and then he is not. He is never addressed. He is never corrected. He is never vindicated. He simply disappears. Think about what that silence means. If Elihu was wrong, why does God not correct him the way God corrected the three friends? If Elihu was right, why does God not acknowledge him the way God acknowledged Job? One possibility is simple. Elihu was a young man at the edge of the conversation. His words, however passionate, did not rise to the level that required a divine response. He was not wrong enough to warrant correction and not significant enough to warrant acknowledgment. He was simply there. But there is another possibility that sits underneath the first one, quieter and more unsettling. Maybe Elihu offered the best possible human answer to the question of suffering. Maybe his theology of instruction and formation was genuinely more sophisticated than anything the three friends produced. Maybe he was, of all the human voices in this debate, the closest to something true. And maybe that is exactly the point. Maybe the author left Elihu unacknowledged precisely because even the best human answer, the most carefully reasoned, the most genuinely helpful reframing of the problem of suffering, still falls short of whatever God is about to offer from inside the storm. Maybe Elihu is the text's way of saying this. Human wisdom, at its very best, approaches the truth. It does not arrive. Because what is coming next is not an argument. It is not a theology. It is not a framework, however sophisticated. What is coming next is a whirlwind, and a whirlwind does not argue. Job has been building toward this since round 1. Not loudly at first. In the early chapters, the demand is buried underneath the theology, visible only if you are reading carefully and listening for what is underneath the words. But as the rounds accumulate, as the friends press harder, and Job pushes back with increasing force, the thing he actually wants becomes impossible to miss. He wants to stand before God and present his case. Not pray, not submit, not accept what has happened with graceful resignation. He wants a formal hearing. He wants the opportunity to lay out his evidence, make his argument, and receive a response that actually addresses what he is asking. He wants what any person wants who has been accused of something they did not do. Not reassurance, not comfort, not the gentle suggestion that perhaps he is missing a larger picture. A fair hearing before someone with the authority to render a real verdict. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would know what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Read that and feel what is living inside it. This is not a man who has lost faith. A man who has lost faith does not want a hearing. A man who has lost faith does not care what the answer would be. Job wants to know what God would say to him. He is burning to know. He believes that if he could just get into the room, if he could just lay out the evidence and make the argument and receive a real response, something important would happen. He believes in the court. He believes in the process. He believes that truth, presented clearly to a fair judge, will produce a just outcome. That is a specific and profound kind of faith. The legal language in Job's speeches has been building for chapters. He uses the Hebrew word rib, which means lawsuit or legal dispute, a formal complaint brought before a court. He reaches for the language of witnesses and testimony and depositions and verdicts. He is not speaking in metaphor. He is describing a real process he wants to initiate. He is, in the most literal sense, the ancient world could support, suing God. But here is the problem Job himself identifies and cannot get around. The defendant is also the judge. There is no court above God. There is no appeals process beyond the Almighty. The entity Job wants to bring charges against is the same entity who would hear those charges, weigh the evidence, and render the verdict. If God decides to silence Job before the case can be heard, there is no higher authority to appeal to. Job sees this clearly. He does not pretend the asymmetry does not exist. He acknowledges that God could simply refuse to engage, could crush him before he finished his opening statement, could end the whole proceeding with a word. And then Job says the thing that might be the most extraordinary line in the entire book. Though he slay me, I will hope in him. Stop there. This sentence has been translated different ways across the centuries, and the Hebrew carries genuine ambiguity. But the most natural reading in context is this. Job is acknowledging that his demand for a hearing might get him killed. Standing before the Almighty with a legal complaint is not a safe thing to do. God is not someone you approach without risk. Job knows this. He is going to do it anyway, because the alternative is something Job cannot choose. The alternative is sitting in silence, accepting the verdict of the friends, confessing to sins he did not commit, performing the repentance that the theological system demands without the personal conviction that would make it real. And doing that would be a lie offered as worship, and Job will not lie to God, not to make the pain stop, not to get his life back, not for any reason. I will defend my ways to his face. This is the center of everything. Job is not claiming to be equal to God. He is not claiming his perspective is complete or his understanding unbiased. He is claiming that his experience of his own life is real, that his innocence is genuine, that those two things deserve to be heard by someone with the authority and perspective to respond to them honestly. There is something almost unbearable about watching this from the outside. A man covered in sores, sitting in ashes, abandoned by his wife, accused by his 3 closest friends who have turned his grief into a criminal proceeding, and he is demanding a fair trial, not from the friends, not from any human authority, from God directly. He believes it matters enough to ask. He believes, in some way he cannot fully articulate, that the relationship between him and God is real enough that a formal complaint has a place inside it, that the life he has lived generates a kind of standing that entitles him to make this demand, not because he is perfect, but because he is honest. Consider what the 3 friends have been offering him. They have been offering him a way out. Confess, acknowledge the sin, perform the required repentance. The system will respond. Things will get better. There is a path back to the world where everything makes sense. And it runs through acknowledging guilt. Job will not take it. Not because he is too proud to examine himself. He has examined himself. He has gone through every category of potential failure with meticulous care. He is refusing not out of arrogance but out of honesty. He did not do the things he would have to confess to doing. Confessing them would be a lie. And he will not lie to God even to make the pain stop, even to get his life back, even if it costs him everything. The 3 friends look at this and see a man too proud to accept correction. What they are actually looking at is a man whose integrity is more fundamental to his identity than his comfort, his safety, or his survival. A man who believes, against all current evidence, that truth told honestly in the right place will be received by someone with the authority to respond to it. He does not know if God will appear. He does not know if the hearing he is demanding will ever happen. He does not know what is gathering at the edge of the world. But somewhere in a storm that has been building since before Job opened his mouth, something is listening, and it is about to answer. For most of the book of Job, God says nothing. This is not a minor narrative detail. It is the experience the book is most honest about. And it is the experience that gets talked about least in the places where Job is usually discussed. Job cries out and hears nothing back. He makes his legal demands and receives no summons. He describes his suffering in some of the most powerful language in the ancient world, and the sky stays quiet. He reaches for God with everything he has. And everything he reaches into is empty. The 3 friends fill the silence with theology. Elihu fills it with youth and passion, and a more sophisticated version of the same theology. Job fills it with argument and oath and legal demand. Everyone in this story is generating words in the direction of the empty sky. The sky does not respond. Think about what it means to pray when nothing answers back. The real kind of prayer. Not the casual kind that asks for a parking space or a good outcome on a test. The kind that happens in a hospital waiting room at 2 a.m. when the news has been bad. The kind that happens in the middle of the night when grief has become physical. When it sits in your chest like something that will not move, no matter what you do. The kind that happens when you have lost something you cannot replace, and you reach for the God you were taught is always present, and you reach into nothing. That reaching into nothing is the middle of the book of Job. Here is what makes Job different from despair in its pure form. He does not stop reaching. Pure despair stops. It accepts the emptiness as the final answer and organizes itself around the absence. Job never does this. He keeps talking. He keeps demanding. He keeps filing his case with a court that shows no sign of being in session. And you do not spend this much energy directing words at someone you believe is not there. You do not file a legal brief against a vacancy. The very persistence of Job's speech is a form of faith, a strange form, a faith that looks nothing like the kind that gets framed on walls or printed on greeting cards. But underneath the rage and the despair and the legal demands, Something in Job still believes there is someone to direct them to. He believes in God enough to be furious at God. That is a different thing from believing in God calmly, from the comfortable distance of a life that has not been tested at its foundations. What Job has is not the faith of a man who finds it easy to believe. It is the faith of a man who has every reason to stop and cannot quite bring himself to. Now here is the observation that the silence of God in Job makes possible, one that no amount of comfortable theology can produce. Job discovers, in the long, terrible quiet of the middle chapters, what his faith actually is. Not what he thought it was when things were good. Not what the system of his theology told him it was. Not the faith that organized itself around the morning sacrifices and the covered gaps and the clean accounts. What is actually there when everything else has been removed? What is there is this: a man who keeps talking to God even when God is not answering. A man who refuses to let the silence be final. A man who keeps insisting, against all current evidence, that the relationship is real enough to sustain a complaint. That is a faith no prosperity can produce, because prosperity never requires it. The ash heap produced it, and the ash heap is about to end. Not because Job found his way back to the certainty he had before. That certainty is gone and it is not coming back. The man who comes out the other side of this is going to be different from the man who went in. And not all of the difference is loss. But the path forward does not run through any human argument, not through Eliphaz's vision, not through Bildad's tradition, not through Zophar's certainty, not through Elihu's sophisticated theology of formation and instruction. The path forward runs through a storm that has been gathering at the edge of the world while all of these human voices were filling the silence with the best they had. Now the storm arrives. Now the sky that has been quiet for 35 chapters opens. Job wanted a hearing. He is about to get something he was not prepared for. Not an explanation. Not a verdict. Something stranger and larger than either one. Something that is going to change everything without answering anything. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. Not out of silence. Not in a dream the way Eliphaz claimed his revelation came. Not through a tradition passed down from the fathers the way Bildad built his arguments. Not in the still small voice that came to Elijah in a different story. Out of a whirlwind. Out of something moving so fast and so large that you cannot stand in front of it without being moved by it. Out of the kind of event that the ancient world understood as the place where the boundary between the human and the divine became thin enough to cross. Job asked for a courtroom. He got a storm. Feel what that means before anything else is said about it. A courtroom is a controlled environment. It has rules and procedures and assigned roles. The judge sits in a specific place. The plaintiff presents evidence in a specific order. Arguments follow a structure designed to produce clarity. Everything in a courtroom moves toward a verdict, a clean resolution, a final word that closes the case and lets everyone go home knowing where things stand. A whirlwind is the opposite of a courtroom. A whirlwind picks up what you thought was fixed and sets it down somewhere else. It does not follow the rules of orderly discourse. You cannot present a legal brief to a whirlwind. You cannot cross-examine a storm. The procedures that govern the kind of hearing Job demands. God is not playing by Job's rules. And then comes the first sentence out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? At first reading this sounds like a dismissal, like God arriving in power and immediately reminding Job of his place. Like the whirlwind entrance is designed to put an end to the legal complaints and the demands for a hearing by simply overwhelming them with the presence of something too large to argue with. But read it again more carefully. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? The word translated as counsel is the Hebrew word etzah. It means wisdom or purpose or the deep ordering principle that underlies the created world. Job's words, God is saying, have been throwing shadow over something real. Not because Job was lying, not because his suffering was not genuine, not because his innocence was not actual, but because Job was speaking about things he did not fully understand, making claims about the nature of divine justice that exceeded what any human being can see from inside a human life. This is a diagnosis, not a dismissal. Job was not wrong about his innocence. He was not wrong to push back against the theology of the friends. He was not wrong to demand a hearing. God will confirm all of this at the end of the book. Job spoke rightly. He was working with an incomplete picture, and the whirlwind has come to show him how incomplete. Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Job prepared his questions. He organized his evidence. He was ready to present his case. Clause by clause, category by category, the way he laid it out in his closing speech. Instead, he is about to be questioned. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding, who determined its measurements? Surely you know, or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? The questions come fast, each one pointing at a specific dimension of creation, inviting Job to locate himself in relation to a particular feature of the world he inhabits. Where were you when the foundations were laid? Job was not there. He arrived into a world already operating, already structured, already moving according to principles established before he existed. He did not choose the rules of the world he inhabits. He inherited them. This is not an insult. It is simply true of every human being who has ever lived. Have you entered into the springs of the sea? Or have you walked in the recesses of the deep? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare. If you know all this, each question places Job in a specific location relative to the size of the world he is living in. Not to humiliate him, not to silence him through the brute force of power, but to do something the three friends never managed to do in all their rounds of argument, to tell him the truth about where he actually is. Then the questions move from the structure of the world to the living things inside it. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the does? Can you number the months that they fulfill? They crouch. They give birth to their young. They let them out, and they go away. Their young become strong. They grow up in the open. They go out and do not return. God is describing the life cycle of a mountain goat. In the middle of a conversation that began with cosmic suffering and legal demands, the creator of the universe pauses to describe how a mountain goat gives birth and how the young go out and do not return to their mothers. Why? Because this too is part of the world. The mountain goat lives and breeds and raises its young and lets them go. Not as backdrop to human drama, not as decoration for a moral lesson, but as its own complete thing. The world is full of these complete things, each operating according to its own nature, each attended to, each part of a whole that is too large for any single perspective to contain. Job's suffering is real. Job's suffering is real in the same way the mountain goat's existence is real, fully and without apology. But the answer to Job's suffering, if there is an answer, exists within a frame so much larger than Job's perspective that no human being can hold it completely in their mind at one time. God is not telling Job that his question is foolish. He is showing Job that the question is real, but the frame around it may not be large enough to contain the whole world. The questions keep coming, 70 of them, each one pointing at a different corner of creation. The storehouses of snow, the channels of rain, the Pleiades and Orion moving in their courses, the eagle nesting on rocky crags and its young drinking blood, the hawk spreading its wings toward the south. Job wanted to know why he suffered. What he is receiving is something different, something that does not answer the question he asked, but begins to change the size of the frame inside which the question was being asked. The courtroom he demanded was too small. The universe arriving in the whirlwind is not. The questions are not random. This is the first thing to understand about the divine speeches, and it is the thing most often missed when people try to explain what God is doing in the whirlwind. The 70 questions move through creation with deliberate structure, beginning with the physical foundations of the world and expanding outward through weather and light and darkness and the deep sea, then moving inward to the wild creatures of the earth and the specific textures of how they live. The movement is comprehensive and intentional, and not one of the 70 questions answers why Job suffered. This has troubled readers for as long as the book has existed. Job spent 35 chapters asking, in various forms, the same essential question: why did this happen to me? He asked it through the framework of innocence and justice. He asked it through the framework of a formal legal complaint. He asked it as a man who had done everything right and wanted to understand how everything right had produced everything wrong. And God answers with questions about the Pleiades. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the belt of Orion? Can you lead forth the Mazzaroth in their season? Can you guide the bear with its children? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you establish their rule on the earth? What does Orion have to do with Job's dead children? At first reading, nothing. And this is where many readers either defend God's response as secretly answering the question Job asked, or feel that the divine speeches are a form of cosmic power play, a being of overwhelming force, using that force to shut down a legitimate complaint. But there is a third possibility, and it is the one the text is pointing toward. God does not tell Job that his question is wrong. The suffering was real. The question was legitimate. The innocence was genuine. All of this will be confirmed at the end of the book when God looks at Job and says, "He spoke what was right." Job's question was not the problem. The problem, if you can call it that, is the size of the frame around the question. Job's question, "Why do I suffer when I am innocent?" assumes a specific picture of how the universe works. A universe organized primarily around human moral activity. A universe where the central dynamic is the relationship between human behavior and divine response. Where the most important things happening at any given moment are the things that concern human beings and their choices and their consequences. The questions from the whirlwind are showing Job a different picture. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? This places Job in time. He arrived into a world already operating according to principles established before he existed. He did not choose the rules. He inherited them. Have you entered into the springs of the sea? There are dimensions of the world Job has never accessed. Realities operating in the deep places that have nothing to do with him. The world is not organized around him. Who has put wisdom in the inward parts? Or who has given understanding to the mind? Who can number the clouds by wisdom? Or who can tilt the waterskins of the heavens? God is describing, with the specificity of someone who made these things and found them worth making, the actual mechanisms of the world, not as abstract power, as concrete and particular features of a reality that operates according to its own nature, a nature far more intricate than any human moral calculus can capture. Now consider what God is not doing in any of these questions. God is not telling Job that suffering has no meaning. God is not telling Job that justice does not exist. God is not telling Job that the moral order he built his life around was wrong. God is not saying, "Look how powerful I am. Stop complaining." Here is what God is doing. The world you are living in contains things I made and attend to that do not fit your categories, that were never designed to fit your categories, that exist as standing evidence that the frame you have been using is not large enough to hold everything that is real. Your theology, and the theology of your three friends, was built to handle the cases where the system appears to work cleanly. It breaks down when confronted with the cases where the wild thing lies in the marsh and the mountain goat gives birth alone on the hillside, and the eagle's young drink blood, and none of it has anything to do with human moral performance. I made those things too, and I have not lost track of you. This is not comfort in the ordinary sense. It is not being told everything will be all right, or that there was a reason, or that the pain served a purpose you will eventually understand. It is something stranger and harder. It is being shown the actual size of the world you are suffering inside, and being told that the God who designed the deep sea and set the morning stars singing has not lost track of a man sitting on an ash heap in the land of Uz. Your question is real, God is saying, and it exists inside a reality far too large for the answer to fit inside the frame you have been using. Does the hawk soar by your understanding and spread its wings toward the south? Does the eagle mount up at your command and make its nest on high? On the rock it lives and makes its home, on the rocky crag and stronghold. From there it spies out the food. Its eyes behold it from far away. Its young ones suck up blood. And where the slain are, there it is. The eagle nests on rocky crags. Its young drink blood. God describes this with the same attentiveness and the same specificity that God brought to the morning stars and the Pleiades and the rain on the desert where no human being lives. The world includes beauty and blood. It includes the nursing doe and the eagle's violent nest. It is not organized to be comfortable. It is organized to be real. Job wanted a world that made moral sense. He was living in a world that makes a different kind of sense. Vaster and stranger and less manageable than the moral calculus he had built his life around. The 70 questions are not an explanation. They are an expansion of the frame large enough that the question Job was asking, though it remains real and legitimate and unanswered, no longer has the power to be the only thing in the room. And Job, who has been talking for 35 chapters with the intensity of a man who believes words are his only weapon, is about to become very quiet, not because he was beaten down, because he saw something he was not prepared to see. And when you see something that large, you need a moment before you can speak again. The whirlwind is still moving. There is one more thing it needs to show him. God is not finished. The 70 questions about the foundations of the earth and the morning stars and the mountain goats have done something to the atmosphere of the conversation. Job has responded twice. Briefly, in ways that suggest a man who has been fundamentally reoriented rather than simply overwhelmed. He has put his hand over his mouth. He has acknowledged that he spoke about things too wonderful for him, things he did not know. But God keeps going. And what God turns to next is the strangest and most unexpected section of the entire divine speech. 2 creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. God spends more time describing these 2 beings than almost anything else in the whirlwind speeches. More time than the foundations of the earth. More time than the weather systems and the storehouses of snow. More time than all the wild animals of the field. The creator of the universe has arrived in a storm to speak to a suffering man who has been demanding answers. And the creator chooses to spend an extraordinary portion of that speech describing, in loving and specific detail, 2 entities that Job has no power over, has never controlled, and in the case of Leviathan, cannot even approach without risking his life. Before we go further, picture the scene. Job is sitting on an ash heap. He has sores on his skin. He has lost his children and his wealth and his health. He has just been questioned about the foundations of the earth and the springs of the sea and the ordinances of the heavens. And now God is describing a creature that eats grass like an ox, but whose bones are like tubes of bronze and whose limbs are like bars of iron. Why? Because these 2 creatures are doing something in the text that no theological argument could do. They are showing Job a dimension of the created order that his entire moral framework had no category for. Behold, Behemoth, which I made as I made you. There it is. Right at the beginning, made as I made you. Behemoth and Job share a maker. The same intentionality, the same creative act, the same divine attention that shaped Job out of dust, shaped Behemoth out of whatever Behemoth is made of. He eats grass like an ox. His strength is in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs like bars of iron. The description has a quality of genuine admiration to it. God is describing Behemoth the way a craftsman describes something they made and are proud of. The strength in the loins, the tail like a cedar, the bones that do not bend. There is investment in this description. Kare, the kind of attention you give to something you find genuinely impressive. He is the first of the works of God. The mountains yield food for him where all the wild beasts play. He lies under the lotus plants in the shelter of the reeds and the marsh. If the river is turbulent, he is not frightened. He is confident though Jordan rushes against his mouth. Nobody tames Behemoth. Nobody traps him. Nobody makes a pet of him or puts him to work. He lies in the marshes, and the river rushes against him, and he is simply not frightened. He exists at a level of the created order that human beings cannot fully access or control. And God made him, the same way God made Job. Then Leviathan. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook? Can you press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose? Can you pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever? The answer to every question is the same. No. Nobody draws out Leviathan with a fishhook. Nobody puts a rope in his nose. Nobody makes a covenant with Leviathan. He exists permanently outside the reach of human control. Permanently outside the boundaries of what human beings can manage or domesticate or bring into the systems they build to make the world feel manageable. Lay your hands on him. Remember the battle. You will not do it again. And then God describes Leviathan in full. Out of his mouth go flaming torches. Sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils comes smoke as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath sets coals ablaze, and a flame comes forth from his mouth. In his neck abides strength, and terror dances before him. The sword that reaches him does not avail. The spear, the dart, the javelin. Iron he treats like straw, bronze like rotten wood. He makes the deep boil like a pot. He leaves a shining wake. One would think the deep to be white-haired. He is king over all the sons of pride. King over all the sons of pride. That phrase is the key that connects Leviathan to everything that has been happening in this story. Pride, in the wisdom tradition of the ancient world, was the fundamental human failure. Not pride in the simple sense of thinking well of yourself. Pride in the deeper sense of placing your own perspective and your own judgment at the center of reality. Mistaking the limits of what you can see for the limits of what exists. Treating the map you have built of the world as if it were the world itself. The three friends were full of this kind of pride, though they would never have recognized it as such. Their certainty about why Job suffered, their confidence that the divine accounting system worked exactly as they described it, their willingness to invent specific charges against a man they loved in order to protect the integrity of their theological framework. All of it was a form of placing their own understanding at the center. And Leviathan is king over all of that. Which means Leviathan, the creature that cannot be hooked or tamed or made a servant of, exists in part as a permanent standing refutation of the idea that human beings can fully systematize the world they inhabit. He is the wild thing that lives outside every system. No theological framework can domesticate him. No moral calculus can account for him. He does not serve as reward for the righteous or punishment for the wicked. He simply is. And God made him. God made Leviathan and attends to Leviathan and describes Leviathan with the same specificity and investment that God brings to everything else in the created order. This creature that breaks every human system is not an error. It is not evidence that the world is chaotic or meaningless. It is evidence that the world is larger and more complex and less manageable than human beings tend to want it to be. Now here is what God is not saying through Behemoth and Leviathan. God is not saying suffering has no meaning. God is not saying justice does not exist. God is not saying the moral order Job built his life around was false. God is not saying, "Look how powerful I am." Stop asking questions. Here is what God is saying. The world you are living in contains things I made and love that do not fit your categories, that were never designed to fit your categories, that exist as evidence that the frame you have been using is not large enough to hold everything that is real. Your friends tried to explain your suffering using a framework that cannot account for Behemoth. Their theology has no room for Leviathan. It was built to handle the clean cases, and it fails completely when it meets the wild thing in the marsh. I made the wild thing in the marsh. I made Job on the ash heap. I have not confused them. I have not lost track of either one. The moral order is real. Justice is real. The relationship between human beings and their maker is real. Job built his life around real things. But those real things exist inside a frame, so much larger than the frame his friends were working with, that the questions which seemed unanswerable inside the smaller frame look different when you see the larger one. Job asked why he suffered. God showed him Behemoth and Leviathan. This is not a change of subject. This is the most honest answer available. Because the honest answer to why Job suffered is not a theological formula that makes the suffering make sense in human terms. The honest answer is that the world is the kind of world where both Job and Leviathan exist, where both the righteous man on the ash heap and the untamable king of the deep are real, where the frame is large enough to hold both, and where the maker of both has not abandoned either one. That is not comfortable, but it is true. And truth, in the end, is exactly what Job asked for. Job answers God for the second time. His first response, somewhere in the middle of the divine speeches, was brief and almost wordless. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, he said, but now my eyes see you. His second response, after everything has been said and the whirlwind has finished, is also short. But the weight in it is not proportional to the length. I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Now resist the temptation to read this the way it has most often been read. The standard reading treats this as Job's capitulation. He pushed back against God. God showed up with overwhelming force. Job got the message and submitted. He was wrong to question. He was humbled. He repented. Case closed. That reading cannot survive the next few verses, where God turns to Eliphaz and says, my anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Job spoke rightly. God says this explicitly. All of it. The complaints and the demands and the legal arguments and the expressions of despair. God looked at everything Job said across 35 chapters and called it speaking rightly. So what is Job repenting of? The phrase, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know, is the key. What Job is acknowledging is not that his suffering was deserved, not that his innocence was false, not that the friends were right about his guilt. He is acknowledging that he was speaking about things he did not fully understand, making claims about divine justice and the operation of the universe that exceeded what any human being can actually see from inside a human life. He was not wrong that he was innocent. He was not wrong to push back against false theology. He was not wrong to demand a hearing. He was working with an incomplete picture, and the whirlwind showed him how incomplete. Now think about what actually changed. Before the whirlwind, Job had a theology, a well-developed, carefully maintained theology that told him how God operated. He had heard about God the way you hear about a country you have never visited. Descriptions from other people, reports from tradition, the testimony of generations who claim to have been there. After the whirlwind, he has been there. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. This is the line that holds the whole story together. The encounter is the thing, not the explanation. The encounter itself. The experience of standing inside a storm and hearing a voice that asks, "Where were you when the foundations were laid?" The experience of being shown Behemoth and Leviathan and the mountain goats and the morning stars. The experience of having the frame expand until it is large enough to hold both Job's suffering and the wild, untamable world that his suffering exists inside. That encounter does not explain Job's suffering. It gives him a place to put it. And that, it turns out, is what he needed more than an explanation. He needed to know that the world he was suffering inside was not the small closed system the friends had described. Not the tight transactional universe where suffering must mean punishment and innocence must mean immunity. He needed to know the world was larger, wild enough to include Leviathan, complex enough to include the eagle's violent nest, real enough to include a righteous man on an ash heap whose suffering has no simple cause. He needed to know that the God who made Behemoth had not lost track of him. And now he knows. He does not stop being wounded. The sores are still on his skin. The children are still gone. The ash heap is still real. What changes is something more specific. He stops being trapped inside the belief that every wound must be explained before life can continue. He stops needing the world to be smaller than it is. He stops requiring his suffering to fit inside a framework that human beings built to make themselves feel safe. He got what he asked for, not the verdict he expected. Something stranger and harder and more real. He asked for a trial and got a universe. He asked for an explanation and got an encounter. And the encounter, for Job, turned out to be enough. Not to close the wound, not to make the loss stop being loss, but to make it possible to stand up from the ash heap and keep living in a world that had not finished surprising him, which is all any of us can really ask for. And which is, quietly, the most honest thing any ancient text has ever said about why good people suffer. Not because we know why, but because the God who does not explain himself has also not abandoned the ash heap. After the whirlwind, after Job has spoken his final words, and the storm has passed, and the ash heap is quiet again, God turns to Eliphaz. Not to Job, to Eliphaz. My anger burns against you and against your two friends. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Let that sentence land before anything else is said about it. The man who cursed the day he was born is called God's servant. The man who demanded a formal hearing, who filed a legal complaint against the Almighty, who said things across 35 chapters that made his three friends reach for their harshest theological language. That man is the one God holds up and says, "He spoke what was right." And the three men who came to comfort him, who never once questioned God, who defended divine justice at every turn, who said all the right things that religious people are supposed to say when they are standing beside someone in pain. Those three men are told that God's anger burns against them. They said the wrong thing about God. Job said the right thing. This needs to be taken seriously on its own terms, not explained away, not softened into something more comfortable. God said it. And then God confirmed it by requiring the three friends to bring offerings and have Job pray for them. Because God will accept Job's prayer and not deal with the friends according to their folly. Their folly. The careful and systematic and internally consistent theology these men deployed across 3 full rounds of argument. The theology they traveled days to deliver. The theology they believed with complete sincerity. God calls it folly. So the question that has been building through this entire story arrives at its sharpest point. What did the friends say that was wrong? And what did Job say that was right? The friends said true things about God. Every single one of them. God is just. God is all-powerful. God does not pervert justice. The moral order of the universe reflects divine character. You could find support for every one of these statements in other parts of the Hebrew Scriptures. You could build a sermon around any of them and no one would object to the content. The problem was not the content. The problem was the function it served. The friends used true statements about God to produce false conclusions about Job. They started with correct theological premises and reasoned their way to accusations that had no basis in reality. God is just. Therefore, suffering implies guilt. Therefore, Job is guilty. Therefore, our job is to identify the guilt and call Job to repentance. The logic chain looks clean, but at the end of the chain, a father sitting in ashes was being told that his dead children died because they sinned, that he himself had withheld water from the thirsty and crushed the orphan, that God had been more merciful to him than he deserved. All of that was false. Every specific application of their theology to Job's situation was false, and the falseness was not incidental to the theology. It was produced by the theology, by a system so confident in its own internal consistency that it could generate specific charges against a specific man without a single piece of evidence, because the system told them what had to be true. This is what God calls folly. The willingness to take a real but partial understanding of God and treat it as a complete one. The willingness to look at a suffering man and tell him with confidence what his suffering means, what he did to deserve it, what God is doing through it, as if the divine perspective fits neatly inside a 3-round debate. The willingness to protect the system even when the system is producing cruelty against the person sitting right in front of you. Job, by contrast, said things about God that were much harder to defend theologically. He said God had turned against him. He said he could not find God when he looked. He said the innocent and the guilty alike were swept away. He said things that, standing alone, look like a man losing his faith rather than exercising it. But Job spoke from inside the reality of his own experience. He did not dress his suffering up in language that made it more palatable. He did not perform a piety he did not feel in order to satisfy the expectations of the people watching him. He brought his actual pain, his actual confusion, his actual rage, directly to God. In the most direct language he had, he did not lie to God to make God look better. That is what God calls speaking rightly. The 3 friends were trying to protect God's reputation. Job was trying to have an honest relationship with God. And God, given the choice between the two, preferred the honest relationship. This should not be as surprising as it feels, but it is, because most religious systems, in practice, reward the management of theological language more than they reward honesty about experience. Say the right things, affirm the right doctrines, perform the right kind of faith, and the performance, because it is accurate in its content, gets received as authentic. Job breaks that assumption entirely. God does not want the performance. God wants the person. And the person who comes to God honestly, even when honestly means arriving in fury and despair and legal demands, is closer to what God is looking for than the person who comes with perfectly arranged theology and a heart more invested in protecting the system than in the relationship. Think about every person who has ever sat in a church or a synagogue and been handed a confident explanation for their suffering that did not match their actual experience. Every person told that their doubt was evidence of insufficient faith. Every person handed a tidy theological framework that did not fit the jagged shape of what they were actually living. Every person who opened their mouth to say the honest thing and was told instead what the right thing to say was. Job's vindication is speaking directly to all of them. The theology of certainty was not what God asked for. The honesty of a person in pain, bringing that pain directly to God without softening it, without cleaning it up for presentation, without performing composure they did not feel. That is what God called speaking rightly. The man who nearly broke himself demanding to be heard was the one who was heard, and the men who came to help him by explaining God ended up being the ones who needed Job to pray for them. The story ends well. Job's fortunes are restored. The Lord gives Job twice as much as he had before. His brothers and sisters and everyone who had known him before come to eat bread with him and console him and give him each a piece of silver and a ring of gold. God blesses the latter days of Job more than his beginning. 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 female donkeys, 7 sons, 3 daughters. He lives for 140 more years. He sees his children and his grandchildren and his grandchildren's children, 4 generations, before he dies old and full of days. This is the happy ending. The part that appears on the final slide of the Sunday school lesson, the part that packages the whole story as a testimony to patient endurance rewarded. Hold on long enough, trust long enough, and the God who permitted the suffering will restore what was lost. And something about this ending has troubled honest readers from the very beginning. The trouble is not hard to find. It lives in the gap between the language of restoration and the reality of what was lost. Job gets new children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. But the children who died when the house collapsed on an ordinary afternoon, they are still dead. The servants who were killed by the Sabians and the Chaldeans and the fire from heaven, they are still dead. The specific texture of the life Job and his wife had built together before any of this happened. The particular shape of their particular mornings and conversations and ordinary days. That cannot be reproduced by new livestock and new children, however abundant. And his wife, she who lost the same children in the same afternoon, she who said the most raw and human thing anyone says in the opening chapters of the book and received 2,000 years of being called the devil's helper in return. The text mentions new sons and daughters without pausing to tell us whether the restoration felt to her the way it is supposed to feel, whether she lay awake thinking about faces that were gone, whether the new children sleeping in the next room felt like grace or like a question she did not know how to answer. The restoration is real, and the loss is also real, and both things coexist in the ending without either one canceling the other out. This is harder to sit with than it sounds, because the religious instinct, when presented with a happy ending, is to let the ending do the theological work. If Job got it all back, maybe the suffering was worth it. If God blessed the latter days more than the beginning, maybe the whole terrible arc was leading somewhere. Maybe the ending is the answer to the question the suffering raised. But the text does not say that. It gives us the restoration and leaves the moral interpretation open. It does not say the new children make up for the old ones. It does not say Job felt whole again in the same way he felt whole before. It says Job died, old and full of days, not full of answers. A life that continued, that accumulated new experience and new love and new ordinary mornings. That did not end on the ash heap, even though the ash heap was real and the losses there were genuine and permanent. The restoration is not an explanation. It is a continuation. And then there is the detail that most people read past without stopping. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he called the name of the first daughter Jemimah, the name of the second Keziah, the name of the third Keren-Hapuk, and in all the land there were no women as beautiful as Job's daughters. And their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. He named them. In the world where Job lived, daughters were not typically named in the final accounting. Sons were named because sons carried the line forward. Because sons were the legal and economic continuation of the father's story. Daughters married into someone else's family. They were beloved, but they were not the part of the record that got written down in the closing summary. But these 3 daughters are named Jemimah, which means dove, Keziah, which means cinnamon, Keren-Hapuk, which means vessel of beauty. 3 names, specific and particular and chosen with care. And their father gave them an inheritance alongside their brothers, which was not the expected thing to do in a world organized the way Job's world was organized. In a book where Job's wife is nearly voiceless, where the woman who shared every loss and carried the same grief and said the most honest sentence in the opening chapters is given one line and then forgotten. The ending pauses to name his daughters, and to give them what they were not typically given. That detail should not be rushed past. It is not a solution to anything. It does not give back the speech the text never gave his wife. It does not compensate for 2,000 years of calling her the devil's helper. It does not make the dead children less dead, or the losses less permanent. But it is a small and specific movement in a direction the rest of the book did not go. A recognition, in the final verses, that the people who are usually unnamed deserve names, that the ones the story might have taught us to overlook deserve to be seen. At the very least, the ending asks us to notice the people the story might otherwise have taught us to overlook. Yemima, Kazia, Kirahapush. 3 names, spoken into the world and left there. Like questions, the book leaves open. Like everything else, the book of Job leaves with us. Not as answers, as gestures. Small, deliberate gestures toward a world that might be slightly more just than the one we started in. We started with a man in ashes. He was scraping open sores with a broken piece of pottery. 3 friends sat around him in silence. 7 days without a word. And 2 questions hung in the air that no one had yet spoken out loud. What do you say to someone who did nothing wrong and lost everything anyway? And what does that mean about the world the rest of us are living in? We have come all the way through the story now. The thresholds and the arguments and the accusations and the whirlwind and the restoration and the naming of the daughters. We have been in the ash heap and in the divine speeches and in the strange silence around Elihu and in the verdict that surprised everyone who thought they knew which side was right. And those 2 questions are still here. They did not get answered. Not in the way that questions are supposed to get answered. With a solution that closes the case and makes further inquiry unnecessary. The book of Job does not work that way. It never worked that way. And part of what makes it worth reading after 3,000 years is precisely that it refuses to work that way. The theology of the 3 friends was designed to answer the question. Suffering has a cause. The cause is moral. Find the cause. Address the cause. And the system restores itself. This version of the answer is the most available, the most comfortable, the most widely distributed across religious traditions throughout human history. It has the advantage of being clean. It has the advantage of telling you what to do. It has the disadvantage of being false in exactly the cases where it is most needed. When the person in front of you is Job, when the system cannot account for what is sitting in the ashes. Job tested that system to destruction, not by arguing against it philosophically, though he did that too, but by being the evidence that the system could not account for. He was blameless and upright, and he sat in ashes, and the system had nothing real to say to him except that he must have deserved it. He did not deserve it. God said so. What Job received instead of an explanation was an encounter, a direct experience of a presence so large that the frame his questions had been asked inside expanded until the questions looked different. Not smaller, not answered. Different. The way a map looks different when you zoom out far enough to see the territory it was trying to describe. He learned to live in the actual world instead of the explained one. And perhaps that is what the book of Job is finally offering. Not an explanation for suffering, not a formula that makes the question go away, but a witness, a 3,000-year-old witness to the fact that the question can be asked fully and honestly and without softening, without the asking destroying the person who asks it. That faith can survive contact with the worst that life delivers. That a man can sit in ashes and demand to be heard and receive something stranger and larger than what he asked for, and come out the other side still alive. Still full of days. The 2 questions are still here. What do you say to someone who did nothing wrong and lost everything anyway? Maybe this. That the world is the kind of world where this can happen. That there are no clean answers. and the people who arrive with clean answers are the ones God finds it necessary to correct. That the honest question, asked in full voice, directed toward the one who might actually be able to respond, is not the absence of faith. It is the most serious form of faith available to a human being, standing inside a reality they did not design and cannot fully understand. And the second question, what does it mean about the world? If this can happen, it means the world is real, all of it. The ash heap and the whirlwind and the daughters named at the end. The grief that has no religious language left, and the encounter that arrives in a storm instead of a courtroom. The God who did not explain himself, and did not abandon the man he was not explaining himself to. The life that continued. The world is real. And the book that refuses to make it smaller than it is has been telling us so for 3,000 years. Job died. Old and full of days. The questions he carried are still alive. That may be exactly how it was supposed to be.